Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to our Thursday morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we are once again looking at Ukraine and at the changing strategic landscape, as well as at the implications for Europe's capacity to act. With 2 months left in office, President Joe Biden authorized the Ukrainian military for the first time on November 17th to use US-supplied long-range missiles to strike targets in Russia. In response, President Putin of Russia adapted Russian nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. On Thursday last week, then, the Ukrainian city of Dnipro was hit by a Russian airstrike, about which officials said it bore the characteristics of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Russia had launched a new conventional intermediate-range missile, codenamed Oreshnik. Now, following the missile launch on Tuesday this week, the 26th of November, NATO ambassadors met in the NATO-Ukraine Council to discuss the security situation in Ukraine, reaffirming their support to Ukraine and arguing that deploying this capability, this Russian capability, will not change the course of the conflict. Meanwhile, of course, the election of Donald Trump as US president is changing the strategic outlook for Ukraine, though how exactly remains uncertain. Whereas Trump had famously claimed in the past to solve the conflict within 24 hours, his national security advisor designate Mike Waltz struck a somewhat more nuanced tone, saying on Fox News recently that the transition team would support providing Ukraine with long-range missiles. Now, against this background of developments, a group of high-level security experts, including several former cabinet members, and also including one of our speakers today, Nathalie Tocci, published an open letter calling for a Canadian-European coalition of the willing that would extend, amongst other things, that would extend air defense over Western Ukraine and deploy coalition troops on the ground, raising, of course, more questions for us to discuss today. And therefore, I'm thrilled to introduce a stellar expert panel. First up will be Dr. András Rácz, who's Senior Research Fellow at DGAP's Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. András has held prior positions at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki and the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs in the GMF. He focuses on Russia's foreign security and defense policy. Glad to have you once again on the morning briefing, András.
Thank you. Good morning.
Next will be Dr. Nathalie Tocci, who's director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome since 2017, and also a member of DGAP's Advisory Council. In the past, Nathalie has advised EU High Representatives Federica Mogherini and Josep Borrell and held previous positions at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, EUI in Florence, and College of Europe in Bruges. Glad to have you again, Nathalie. And last but not least, Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp is since October 2023 a senior associate research fellow at DGAP's Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. He was previously director of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, the BACS, and from 2007 to 2013, he was research director at the NATO Defense College in Rome. I'm glad to welcome you as well, Dr. Kamp. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We'd like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks and then open up for questions after about 20-25 minutes or so. András has to leave a bit early, so we try to squeeze in a few questions before he has to leave and catch his flight. If you'd like to ask a question, please use your raise your hand function. And when invited to speak, briefly say who you are and keep your questions or comments relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues supporting this event series, Henning Hoff, Milan Nitsch, Julia Löwer, Wiebke Evering, Helga Beck, and many others. Now, without much further ado, over to you, András. Can you tell us a little bit about the military situation at the front, the new developments of the last week, and this mysterious Russian ballistic missile? Thank you.
The front line is more or less stable everywhere, except in the south. In the south, Ukraine is losing ground. The city of Kurahovo is going to fall soon. Russia is suffering extremely high losses. Nevertheless, they will maintain this attrition rate, this speed of advance, this intensity until the 20th of January. Generally speaking, the Russian losses are equal to 2 battalions every day. This is extreme. This is the highest loss rate since the beginning of the war. Intensity, the growing intensity is visible also in the air. October brought the highest number of Russian missiles and projectiles fired upon Ukraine. Solely in October, Russia fired more than 2,000 drones and missiles on Ukraine. Ukrainian air defense is more or less coping with the drones, yet still every day a few dozens get through. So they are inflicting increasing damage on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. When it comes to the Russian missile fired upon Dnipro, while Ukraine claimed that this was an intercontinental ballistic missile, in fact, it wasn't. This was an intermediate range ballistic missile, kind of a derivative of the Russian RS-24 ERs. RS-24 Rubezh, RS-26 Rubezh. So there is an intercontinental ballistic missile from which Russians made a smaller version capable of firing a nuclear warhead. This is the so-called Rubezh. And the missile fired upon Dnipro is the conventional version of this RS-26 Rubezh. Good news, two good news. The first good news, the weapon is not yet ready. The missile fired upon Dnipro did not have a live warhead. It only had kind of inert practicing warheads, so passive warheads. That's why even though they inflicted some damage on the ground due to the kinetic energy, there were no explosions. When it comes to the other good news, that before the launch, around 30 minutes before the launch, Russia properly warned the United States. And the United States warned the Brits and the French. The Russian intention with the warning was to avoid any unwanted escalation, so to make sure that the US does not mix up the launch of this missile with the nuclear loaded ICBM. So even though Russia tries to make the best believe, and also Ukraine believe that it's ready to go to the extremes, risk a nuclear war, in fact, the story looks like exactly the opposite. Russia acted absolutely rationally, so properly warned the US on time before launching the missile. The bad news, once this missile gets completed, it will be the most dangerous weapon Russia has deployed so far against Ukraine. The ballistic missile Russians have been using against Ukraine so far have had a maximum range around 500 kilometers. This missile has a range around the maximum range of 5,000, meaning if this missile gets completed, again, it's an experimental weapon. We don't know when it gets completed. We don't know when serial production will start. However, once it gets completed, Russia will be able to hit any territory of Ukraine, and the ballistic missile is extremely hard to defend against. So this is the bad news. So that's it from me for the start. Again, apologies for the sound. Jan, I'm giving you back the floor, and if you have any questions, I'm doing my best to answer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, András. Let's quickly move on to Nathalie. Given this dire military situation at the front, and given the US elections, what's your perspective on Europe's strategic position at the moment? And perhaps you could say a few words about the open letter as well. Over to you, Nathalie.
Okay. Firstly, I'm really glad that we managed to listen to András, because what he had to say was extremely important. I think to me, the first bit of the story really has to do with not so much what Europe does or what Ukraine does, but what we can imagine the dynamic being, obviously, between Washington and Moscow. And the way I see it, and perhaps I'm slightly sort of, painting a very black and white picture here, but I think it's worth doing as an exercise, is really trying to sort of understand what the what the possible scenarios really are. So we can imagine that there is going to be some sort of first move coming from Washington. And, I'm not going to get into the details of this because it has been described in various ways. I mean, I think the kind of contours of the kind of proposals that might be coming from Washington, as regarding how the war could end and how the conflict could be solved, are more or less, the contours are more or less clear, I would say, right? I mean, you kind of keep what you have already taken. There will not be a de jure recognition of it. There will be a de facto recognition of it. There will not be NATO membership for the foreseeable future. There will not be US troops on the ground. Europeans can do their thing, but we know Donald and Vladimir. We know that Europeans are kind of weak, so it doesn't really matter anyway. And that's kind of the deal, right? Now, I think where it becomes trickier is to try and figure out what happens next. And granted that it may not be, as I said, as black as white as I'm painting it, but still, what happens next is what is Moscow's reaction to that. And there, I think, there are kind of two possible futures. Because you have, future number one, in which Putin says, well, okay, fine, I don't really care about Donbass because my war aims are essentially unchanged. However, there's a certain convenience in kind of pretending that this is okay for me, especially considering the kind of losses that András was referring to, the 2 battalions per day. And so, it may be in my interest to basically, take the bait, pretend that there's a truce, and especially given that there won't be any, NATO on the horizon, US troops on the ground, and, me, Putin, I think that Europeans indeed are kind of weak and they're not really going to do what they say anyway. A kind of Minsk on steroids may be in my interest, right? In my kind of short-term interest. So that's kind of scenario one. Scenario two is, and what I mean by Minsk on steroids is, essentially just kind of, this situation continuing for maybe 2-3 years, and then, towards perhaps the end of the Trump administration, going for the next gulp of European territory and peoples. Scenario two is really one in which Putin doesn't take the bait, right? Because he's on a roll. And so why stop? I mean, it's true that what András was describing, is in a sense a dynamic in which, you could try and maximize the territory that you gained prior to January. But it may be that, especially if some of the things that András was describing in the south, Russia's on a roll, Putin may not have an interest in stopping at that point in time. So, and especially with Trump in the White House, he may think to himself, well, when am I going to get this opportunity again, right? So why stop now? Now, why do I paint these two scenarios? And I said, I appreciate the fact that reality is probably going to be slightly messier and kind of, there are shades of gray in between these two scenarios. But I think it puts us as Europeans in two very different kinds of dilemmas. In scenario one, where I think the dilemma is, so basically the one in which Putin takes the bait and there is some sort of truce, right? That is a scenario which I think is politically very challenging, militarily, oddly speaking, less so, yeah? What do I mean by this? Politically, there is a real risk of Europe fracturing in that scenario, because it's very clear that countries in Northern and Eastern Europe would be fairly clear-eyed in realizing that this is no peace, right? And if anything, it is the preparation for the next round of war. And they would hold that position. Countries more towards the West and the South, certainly my own, and I'd be interested to hear what you think actually Germany's position would fold. Yeah, I mean, how could you possibly be against peace? And, they've been waiting for an opportunity to fold for a while, certainly my own government. And so, there would be a political divide in Europe. And that political divide would actually make it harder to agree on the kind of things that we should be agreeing militarily. Now, militarily, in principle, you would be in a slightly easier position because at least you would have a little bit of time to do many of the, sort of incredibly important things that we have to do, both as far as Ukraine itself is concerned, be it in terms of actually deploying what in that scenario would be described as peacekeepers, but also thinking about extending, sort of plans for European air defense, extending those to Ukraine as well. In any, sort of more broadly, building up our military capacities, because obviously it would be, even in that first scenario, as one in which it would be in preparation for an eventual new round of fighting. But at least you would have, let's say, 2 or 3 years to do and really speed up on many of those sort of lines of work. But politically, as I said, very difficult to do so, because there would be that sort of centrifugal forces in Europe really tearing us apart. Now, the opposite scenario, the one in which Putin doesn't take the bait, obviously would put us militarily in a much harder position, because we're in, that is a scenario in which the military escalation actually continues, right? And we don't quite know what the US reaction might be, but it could be that the US reaction is, well, it's not really our problem, right? If one is to think of the worst. So militarily, in a sense, we wouldn't even have those 2 or 3 years, right? It would be about doing it kind of yesterday. But politically, we would be far more united in doing so, because, of course, there wouldn't be an option of having peace on the table and having that divide in Europe. So
Nathalie.
I guess, and I'll stop here, Jan, but I guess what I'm saying here is that I think we should be thinking, even if in a slightly schematic way, of those 2 possible kind of futures there, and thinking what the implications are both for the politics and for the military fronts.
Sorry to stop you there, Nathalie. We'll come back to both those scenarios in a few minutes. But since András has to leave in about 6.5 minutes, I wanted to invite everyone to start asking questions to András in the chat, perhaps, while I'm handing over the floor to Karl-Heinz Kamp for his initial input. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Jan. Before I actually wanted to talk about the nuclear implications, whether we are closer to a nuclear escalation. But let me spend a minute on this famous open letter, which, by the way, hasn't been signed by any German parliamentarian. It is a no-brainer that Europe has to do more for defense, not to please Trump, but to take care of its own security. This should not be impossible, by the way, because the GDP of the European NATO members is 15 times bigger than the one of Russia. I have my doubt on these kind of open letters, though, because first, we have an inflation of them. And second, I think we should not preach the desirable over the reachable. And this is something that happens, in my view, in this Canadian-European open letter. 3 quick points. First, Canada ranges very prominently in this open letter. At the same time, Canada has the worst GDP defense budget ratio in NATO, 1.37%, I think, and it promised to reach to 2% in 2032. So I wouldn't feel very well for strengthening NATO. Second point, the open letter calls for seizing all frozen financial assets of Russia to finance the support for Ukraine, and it says that this is legal. And the authors point to a study of the KSE Institute. I had to check up what the KSE Institute is. It is from the Kiev School of Economics. Nothing against the Kiev School of Economics, but this is not an unbiased point. And it's very legally disputed whether we can take all the frozen assets to give it to Ukraine. And third point is that the open letter calls for a coalition of the willing, Canadian, European, to put their forces on Ukrainian soil. It's a bold request, because the question is what happened if these forces get killed by Russian attacks? Are these coalition forces retaliating to Russia? And does this imply Article 5? So I think this requires a little bit more serious second thoughts. Is there something useful Europe and Canada can do? Yes. We could increase our defense spending by to at least 3%. Since Nathalie was asking on the German situation, Germany started strongly with a Zeitenwende. Unfortunately, in the last year, it faded away a little bit, not at least because Chancellor Scholz seemed to be concerned about the popularity of his defense minister. So actually, partly the Zeitenwende was partly sacrificed for domestic reasons. We will have a new government in Germany soon, and if a chancellor Merz comes, that means that he will have to do everything he promised or he requested as the opposition leader, which means delivering Taurus and increased defense spending, which is not bad for Ukraine. Last remark on the famous 2%, the German Bundessondervermögensgesetz, the law that codified the 100 billion, says explicitly, if the 100 billion are used up, Germany will provide a defense budget, I quote, sufficient to fulfill NATO's planning goals. Not sure whether everyone in the Bundestag has properly read what he signed, but this means this is significantly more than 2%. Now to the issue of the escalation on both sides in the war. We have an escalation on both sides. The US has permitted the use of ATACMS missiles on Russian territory. They did it already before, but under different conditions. And this enables also the use of the Storm Shadows and the Scalp missiles, because they both use a US-based navigation system, and the US delivered landmines. And then on the Russian side, as András has said, there was this launch of this famous MIRV missile with the multiple warheads, and we have a change in the Russian nuclear doctrine, which Putin talked about. Does this mean that we are closer to nuclear escalation? Let me make 3 quick points. First, nuclear escalation in this war cannot be excluded. The fact that Moscow did not cross the red line 3 or 4 times doesn't mean it doesn't cross it the 5th time. I'm personally not overly concerned about this for a number of reasons. However, I'm not sure whether Putin is actually reasoning the same way. Second point, any nuclear escalation will be decided by Putin and by no one else, regardless what a doctrine or what a paper, what anything else says in Russia. Russia seems to be torn, or Putin seems to be torn on this. On the one hand, as András was saying, Russia is acting fairly risk-averse with regard to this issue, particularly if it comes to including NATO territory in any kind of escalation. Second, Putin, on the other hand, Putin seems to be frustrated that his nuclear threats he was mentioning, or he was making basically from the beginning of the war, did not prevent the West from supporting Ukraine. And this means that nuclear, or that considerations on nuclear escalations will be determined by developments on the battlefield, as we had in late 22, when Russia was perceived to lose, and there were some talks apparently about nuclear escalation in the Kremlin. The US unmistakably communicated the consequences and re-established deterrence. Third point, last point, I think that the missile launch and the Putin speech on the nuclear doctrine are means of nuclear signaling, of trying to re-establish deterrence. As András was saying, it's not going well for Russia. There is no major breakthrough. We are now up to 650,000 casualties on the battlefield, including North Koreans and Yemenites on the battlefield. Is not a sign of strength. I think that Putin once again hopes to frighten the West to prevent further support for Ukraine. And of course, we should not let him succeed. Yes, further support of the West always implies the danger of escalation, but the consequence cannot be ending the support because of nuclear concerns. So I think this is the course we should have. How the Trump administration reacts on this is an open question. No one knows. Let me stop here.
Thanks a lot. And again, apologies that András, our colleague, had to leave early because he has to catch a flight. But as you saw in the chat, he invites you to send him an email if you have any follow-up questions. I believe there are a couple of things that, Nathalie, you might want to pick up on from what Karl-Heinz Kamp just said, especially about the open letter that you're one of the signatories of. And then let me invite everyone in the audience to come forward and raise their hands and pose questions to our panel. But first, over to you, Nathalie.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mean, I think as far as the open letter is concerned, I mean, I think the usefulness of these things, if any, is that of pushing the envelope of the debate. So not necessarily because everything is going to happen, but I think there, if there is any use at all, I think it is that. But let me kind of raise two points. I mean, the first, agreed on everything that concerns defense spending. On the question of troops on the ground and the seizing of financial assets, this is all very well if we don't consider what is happening in Ukraine as a European war, a war on the European continent. Yeah, I mean, if we think of ourselves as still being somehow living in a wonderful world at peace, then indeed, I think all of these considerations are extremely relevant. It is only the minute in which you face to the very harsh reality that actually there isn't an alternative, right? I mean, let us take the case of the seizure of financial assets. These legal questions are extremely important, but they're extremely important in a situation in which you have an option of either doing it or not doing it. If you're in a situation in which you don't have that option anymore, right? Because you are completely abandoned by the United States, because there is an escalation that continues, and because this is, think of the kind of, let's put ourselves, I don't know, Second World War, yeah? And there is a pot of money there, and it's available. And, this is an existential battle. Would we really be thinking about, is it legal, not legal to use it? Of course we would be using it, right? So I think the reasoning that detracts us, sort of pulls us back from engaging in certain decisions are, I think that the reason for the break is essentially connected to the fact that we haven't made that mental switch in realizing that this is our war as well. And at some point, I think that realization will come. And the minute in which, and in fact, the longer we kind of delay that realization, the more costly it will be for us. And so, as I said, one can take issue with one proposal as opposed to another, but to me it's the premise of the reasoning which is the thing that we really should be talking about.
Thanks, Nathalie. Since I don't see any questions yet from the audience, I have one for Karl-Heinz Kamp. We had the president of the Federal Intelligence Service, Bruno Karl, here at DGAP last night for a talk. One of the things he said was that there was evidence that on the Russian side in the Kremlin, senior officers did not believe the Article 5 deterrence to some extent. Now, given what you just said earlier on the reasoning and nuclear rationale depending on Putin rather than any set Russian strategy, I wonder to what extent the usual rules of nuclear deterrence work. If it all depends on Putin. So how would you respond to that?
Well, these are two things basically interconnected, the Article 5 issue and the nuclear deterrence issue. Both things are ambiguous. Article 5 is an ambiguous article. It doesn't commit anyone in NATO to anything, by the way. It says that if an attack occurs, every member takes the means he deems appropriate, which means theoretically a letter of condolence would be enough. However, NATO made clear over decades that it is credible today, not at least because of the stationing of NATO forces on other countries' territory. So this is, I think, a fairly safe thing. The same with nuclear deterrence. Will NATO retaliate, or will the US retaliate with a nuclear weapon if Russia attacks Poland? No one knows, and I don't want to find out. But Putin doesn't know either. And this is the entire idea of this ambiguity. If, for instance, yes, okay, Donald Trump said in February he will not do anything for the Europeans, so perfect, now I can attack Poland. Maybe if he's wrong, and if he miscalculates, the damage for Russia is incredible, or will be incredible. And this is always what makes deterrence work. can you be sure at the end of the day, not only in the case of the real use, which no one of us wants to find out, you can be sure. But the fact that Russia did not cross any red lines, that Russia did not, for instance, as Putin was saying at the beginning, he would attack the military hubs in Poland where all the support for Ukraine goes through, he didn't do it. As has been said by András, that the US is properly warned, okay, only 30 minutes before, according to certain international agreements, it should be 24 hours in advance, but Russia doesn't have an interest in uncontrolled escalation because the damage for Russia would be incredible. Can this change in a situation when Putin feels himself painted in a corner? I don't know, maybe. Still, the question would be then for Putin, what do I win? What would I achieve if I would launch a nuclear demonstrative strike over the Baltic? Okay, we have a hole in the Baltic, but what does it change on the battlefield? So all these questions would be involved. I don't know how Putin would act, but I think so far deterrence has been very efficient.
Mm-hmm. Then again, I suppose you could ask, what did Putin really achieve in Ukraine so far? But as you said, it's a very, very difficult, tough question. Let me give the floor to Klaus Wittmann.
Good morning. I agree with everything that Karl-Heinz said about nuclear weapons, and I would add China, whose support Putin would lose, I think, if he did anything with nuclear weapons. But I have three quick questions. Nathalie talked about peacekeepers, and that sounds very harmless. Is any of you aware of what that means in terms of troops, international participation, etc., for security guarantees in the framework of any ceasefire? Second, a little bit of psychology. I was not there when Rutte visited Trump, but I would suspect that in the way he talks to him, he would have asked him, do you really want to look weak vis-a-vis Putin and become a Chamberlain of the 21st century? And my third question, Nathalie mentioned Germany. And I've just written about our peace chancellor and the role of Ukraine in the German election campaign. But today I heard something about a German Sonderweg to be in the offing, and that Pofalla and Platzek are active preparing ceasefire conditions which go in the direction of Putin's aims. Has any of you heard about that, Karl-Heinz, for example?
Thanks a lot. So let me direct the first two questions, the one on peacekeepers and the one on Rutte Trump, to Nathalie. And then after that, I'll hand over to Karl-Heinz Kamp.
So on the peacekeepers and the security guarantees, I'm really glad, Klaus, that you raised this question, because I think it is actually the key question, right? And I think it's the key question actually in both scenarios. So both in the scenario in which there is a temporary truce and the scenario in which there isn't one, right? Now, the one in which there isn't one, they're obviously not peacekeepers, right? And here is where we get into the debate of sort of, troops on the ground and what does this actually mean? And again, I think this is something that we should be seriously thinking about. No, I don't see, obviously, European soldiers on the front line in the Donbass. But I do think that we should be having a debate about, training and, sort of freeing up resources, Ukrainian resources that can actually be moved to the front line. And I say this because, this is the way in which this war is being globalized. I mean, think about, again, sort of the North Korean troops on, how many centuries do we need to go back before we get to sort of East Asian troops on, fighting a war on European soil? I think that we still kind of are, as I said, kind of trapped in this world in which we assume we live in peace, and we no longer do, right? And the sooner we come to that realization, the better it is. Anyway, that's the scenario in which war continues. The other scenario, which I actually think is not necessarily radically different, is indeed the truce one. Yeah. Now, again, no one, I think, in their right mind will assume that a truce is anything close to sustainable, unless there's a very significant presence of European troops on the ground, monitoring that, those thousands of kilometers that would presumably would separate sort of free Ukraine from occupied Ukraine. And I think no one in their right mind assumes not only, that this would be a totally stable and calm, in a sense, front line, because, as I said, in the best of circumstances, this would be a situation in which Putin would be, not necessarily in the first couple of months, but certainly in the first couple of years, be looking for the opportunity to restart, right? So, this is not a kind of uniform story, right, in which you're talking about a few thousand people. I mean, here we're talking about something far, far, far more significant, and in a situation of almost kind of, sort of combat ready, sort of situation. I think that this is actually part and parcel of the debate on security guarantees, because in a sense it is that presence on the ground which in itself forms part of the guarantee. So I think that this is and it is not something that the US will be doing, right? So whatever will happen after January, I think that this is something that we should be having a very serious debate about. Hang on, I forgot what the second question was.
Rutte, Trump being weak.
Sorry?
Rutte,
Trump being weak. He doesn't like being weak. Look, I don't know. I mean, I think sort of we tend, and certainly kind of Ukrainians tend to think, hope, assume that the minute in which kind of, Putin gives the middle finger to his friend, or maybe not so friend Donald, that, Donald doesn't like being treated this way. He doesn't like exactly looking weak, and he would double down in terms of support for Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I wonder whether this is wishful thinking. I wonder whether in that kind of scenario, especially given that, as I said, I kind of painted them as two very different scenarios, but probably reality is some sort of fudge in between. I wonder whether, Trump that actually doesn't really care about European security.
Seem to be cut off there, Nathalie. But let me hand over to Karl-Heinz Kamp for the question about a German Sonderweg ceasefire preparations going on in the background. Over to you, Karl-Heinz Kamp.
Okay, I mean, we have an election campaign coming up in which the Social Democrats, all the more left-wing parties, Social Democrats, the BSW, AfD, not left-wing, but still in the same camp, will position the social question against defense spending and support of Ukraine, which means, do you want to, or we will not sacrifice the Bürgergeld for weapons for Ukraine. So if we solve the war, if we end the war, then we don't have this problem anymore. This is going to determine the next month because of the election campaign. In general, I'm very optimistic because we had two polls which came up in the recent weeks, one from the Körber Foundation and the other one from the Bundeswehr, both saying that there is a threat awareness in Germany, both saying that there is a majority still for keeping up the sanctions against Russia. There is still a majority for supporting Ukraine. So this, I think, is a stable consensus in Germany. And by the way, the government did not fall apart because of arguing on whether or not supporting Ukraine or whether or not raising defense budget. They fell apart on whether or not doing it by taking more public debt or by reprioritizing our expenditure. So I think this is the issue. So I think we will have to get used to it. And we have in all parties, by the way, those also in the CDU, those who believe that the war could be negotiated to an end. One point on this issue of Trump weak or not. whatever Trump will say, and maybe he says, I will go on supporting Ukraine because I don't want to be weak, or I don't want to be perceived as being weak, but he will only do it if the Europeans do more and do their share. Because the US position, not only by Trump, is you in Europe have 30 days of vacation. We in the US have 10 or 12. We are not willing to risk more of our wealth if you are not doing the same, if you are not willing to reprioritize your spending. So I think Trump, yes or no, it is something we have to do anyway.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. There is a question in the chat about regime change by Stefan Schumacher asking, basically, can't the West do anything to do away with Putin? Because as long as Putin is in charge, there will not be a real firm peace with Russia. That is one question. I also want to pick up a question by Philip Hesemetzer, who's had his hand up for a while. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So actually, my question goes into a similar direction. That we talk a lot about the weakness or lack of stamina of Europe and possible lack of interest of the US. At the beginning, András touched a bit on, the enormous losses suffered by the Russians. I wonder, we tend to see Russia as this sort of inexhaustible war machine. They're suffering losses, but they keep on going. But I wonder, are there not any other angles where we could put more pressure on Putin? It seems to be lacking from the public debate. I would be keen to hear from the panelists. And just one comment on East Asians fighting in Ukraine. If I'm correctly informed, actually that happened in the Second World War too. I think North Koreans fought. The Russians did the same thing. Essentially. But so my question would be, how can we really increase the pressure in a smart way? I guess the additional challenge is that we as Europeans will have to do it on our own, assuming that we'll just have, at the very best, an erratic American president, and certainly not a very strategically a functioning presidency. Thank you very much.
Right. Do you want to pick up these questions first, Karl-Heinz, Kamp, perhaps?
On this regime change thing, I take them together. I think there's nothing that can be done from outside to support any kind of regime change. I also think that indeed, with the Putin regime, there is no chance for any kind of negotiations. That's what our chancellor experienced when he called Putin. On the other hand, dictatorships seem terribly stable until they collapse all of a sudden, which means we don't know how long Russia can sustain these terrible loss rates, basically risking its own future economically. Apparently, you can do this, and I think the parallels to the Third Reich are very strong, where you had a public support till the very end of the Second World War, because there was this feeling, and you have the same elements in Russia by saying it's the right course, all the rest is against us, and this is a strongly mobilizing element for the public. You don't see any public protests in Russia. So it can go for a while, but at the same time, it can collapse very quickly, and all these black swans, like the Prigozhin issue, we do not have on the map. So I think the way how Russia leads the war in any kind of war economy makes you sustain a war longer, but it ruins your economy in the long term. So I think, I'm convinced that Russia cannot sustain this endlessly. However, no one knows when the tipping point comes, and I don't think that we can do anything from outside on this, except raising the sanctions, which once again increases the pressure. At the same time, sanctions always hurt us, so it's always a political game. And if I may say one sentence on Nathalie's point on seizing the money, yes, I would love to do it. Of course, if we could seize the 300 billion, that would help a lot. The problem is I'm not convinced that London is ready to risk the finance place of London by doing something which is not legal. I'm not convinced whether Belgium is ready to seize or to risk its place for having other countries putting their money there. So yes, in an ideal world, we should take it, but it's not going to happen.
Nathalie.
Yeah, I mean, on this, and then I'll come back to my point is, yes, you're absolutely right. Today, they're not willing to risk it, but that's because they think they have an alternative, right? There is a world out there in which somehow life goes on, right? And life goes on while keeping the financial system intact. While I'm talking about a scenario, I mean, a situation, which I think is the one that we're already in, but we just, we can't get ourselves to, we can't shake ourselves out of this comfort zone in which we think there is an alternative, right? The minute in which you realize that there isn't an alternative and you just need the money, well, I mean, yes, it's not a question of risking it. It's just that, you've got your back to the wall. The point is, the longer we delay realizing that we have our backs to the wall, the more costly this war is going to become. That's my only point. But I agree with you, Karl-Heinz, that today that realization is not there. On the question of regime change in Russia, I have actually a very, very similar answer to the one that Karl-Heinz just gave. I think that this is true of dictatorships. I mean, you just don't know what happens in the black box. And actually, you have very, very, very little influence over this particular black box. So I don't think that this is I don't think we should be really thinking about this, because there's no point thinking about something that you've got no power over whatsoever. And it is only safe to assume that it will go on for a long time, right? Given that you've got no power over it. And then in a sense, if that assumption proves to be too pessimistic and something does happen, all the better. But safe to assume that it will simply carry on for the time being. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be doing more. And I think it's actually quite shocking the way in which, all the loopholes in our sanctions regime are still there. But this goes back to my earlier point, yeah? I mean, the truth of the matter is that we have not been willing to take the costs of this war because we haven't felt it as our war, right? And this is essentially why there are all sorts of loopholes and, in the sanctions regime. Now, would a tightly implemented sanctions regime necessarily lead to a radically different result certainly in the short or medium term? Probably not. It is also true that the world has changed and, there are alternatives to the West. But would a tightly implemented sanctions regime be able to inflict a lot more damage than what we have done in the last 3 years? Absolutely so. And the reason why we haven't done it is because it's very convenient not to do it and continuing not to do it. And this is what I'm trying to get at in talking about costs, which are actually piling up. And eventually we are the ones that will have to pay the bill.
Mm-hmm. A question from Tom O'Donnell.
Yeah, just to Nathalie quickly. You discussed this issue of what if Putin blows off Trump essentially, and there's this idea that he might get angered. It's true, he might get angered and do various things, but he's got a lot of things he could do to really hurt Russia, short of sending troops. And furthermore, if you look at the example in when the Iranians actually tried to bait Trump into a war by attacking Saudi Arabia directly or indirectly during his term. And, he didn't care the criticism he got for not defending Saudi Arabia. He wasn't going to be suckered into a war. And I think that's how he'll feel about it. If European troops aren't bleeding and dying, aren't committed, he's not going to do it. And I have to frankly say, the American people are going to support him in that, probably. A quick question to Karl, if you don't mind, and that would be, it's not only the matter of peacekeeping, but the same problem with the logic of the war, the way it's going. If there's a breakthrough, Macron has indicated that, perhaps troops should be put there. And it seems to me there's this sort of magic line of the Dnieper, that Europe at some point would have to say that this is a red line, Putin's not going to cross it. And I've asked this question at the anniversary celebration of 25 years in NATO in Warsaw the other day. I won't tell you what they said, but it's down to, I would say, France, UK, and Poland. Will they commit troops? Will they draw a line, or won't they in that circumstance? Otherwise, there's not going to be a Western Ukraine like a Western Germany or something.
Thanks a lot for those two questions. There's also a question in the chat by Dr. Arno Juncker about a potential American strategy of putting Russia under strain by driving down the oil price, by increasing domestic production, basically. And if I may throw in a question of my own as well, since we're coming to an end, and this will be the last round of questions, I was wondering, Nathalie, if you could say a word about the new European Commission that was approved yesterday, and what the chances are of the European leadership to prevent the kind of fractures that you rightly pointed out in the beginning. Okay, so we've got oil prices, EU Commission, Macron red lines, and the Putin-Trump dynamic. Shall we start with you, Nathalie, and then move on to Karl-Heinz Kamp?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment on, because my line was cut off temporarily, momentarily when I was talking about. I would actually agree with that assessment. Meaning, I actually think that it is far too optimistic to assume that if Putin says no to Trump, Trump gets angry and doubles down on Ukraine. I think it is far more likely that Trump somehow totally drops the ball. And here you are, and this is what I'm saying, that is a scenario in which there is an escalation, and an escalation that we as Europeans have to deal with completely on our own. And I think that is, as I said, a far more kind of realistic scenario in my mind of a scenario in which indeed there isn't a truce. On the question of the new commission and its ability, well, look, you could say this is the best of the best possible outcome in a pretty dire political kind of environment. Is it therefore sufficient for the commission to muster the kind of strength to pull, to sort of engender unity? I don't know. I don't think so, to be honest. I think that it is a commission which, in many respects, has become an increasingly politicized commission. If you think of it, I mean, the minute in which actually this started with Juncker, yeah, I mean, the political commission, it then became the geopolitical commission, and it was initially about being, on the one hand, more connected to the citizens and more. And the truth is that it has become a politicized commission. And as the politicization of the commission has inevitably reflected the growing sort of nationalism, in a sense, I'm just not sure that this commission has what it takes to bring those member states together, because in many respects, it's simply a reflection of it. Once upon a time, a commissioner would describe his member state as the country he or she knows best, right? Now it is all about, the Italian commissioner, the French commissioner. This is not the kind of commission that can engender unity unless that unity comes from the member states themselves.
Did you want to say a word on Tom O'Donnell's question on the dynamic between Putin and Trump and the likely responses of Trump?
This is what I'm saying. I think that in that scenario, I agree with him. I think in that scenario, it is far more likely that Trump drops the ball on Ukraine. I think that is more likely than a Trump response that kind of gets offended and therefore sort of becomes the first defender of Ukraine. I think that's wishful thinking, to be honest.
Right.
So
thank you, Nathalie. Over to you, Karl-Heinz Kamp.
Thank you. Just a word on this Trump thing. A person who changes his mind 5 times a day is by definition very difficult to predict. So basically everything can happen on any scenario. On the stationing of troops on the ground, Yes, we can discuss this, fine. However, then we have to have a tough discussion on what this means, whether this mourir pour Kiev is still, whether the sentiment is there. Monsieur Macron sometimes is a little bit quicker in his statements than maybe his country is. So I'm not sure whether France is really ready to do this beyond technical assistance or beyond training. Poland maybe, Germany certainly is not. So yes, unfortunately, Nathalie, we do not have the feeling of this Second World War. We need a global effort against this Hitlerism. We just don't have it. Can we get it by putting troops on the ground and having then the body bags coming back? I'm not sure. So it is just I'm very positively surprised how strongly still after more than 2.5 years, Europe and others, the West, is supporting Ukraine. I hadn't expected this in February 22. However, there are certain limits which we means most of NATO, are just not willing to cross. And I think troops on the ground is one of them.
Well, let me thank all of our speakers, András, Rácz, Nathalie, Tocci, and Karl-Heinz Kamp, for an extremely interesting and very timely discussion today. We will certainly come back to this topic and others in future iterations of our Thursday morning briefing series. For now, thanks everyone in the audience as well for tuning in and asking good questions, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.